Ben Rhodes, thanks for joining us on the BBC.
Good to be with you.
Obviously, there's been great shifts in the relationship between the United States and Cuba in recent months. How would you characterize it at the moment? What state is it in?
Well, I'd characterize it as the Trump administration essentially hit the pause button on the momentum that was being created by the engagement. We had initiated a whole volume of activity that led to diplomatic cooperation, increased travel, increased commerce, and Trump's announcements had the effect of essentially stopping all that in its tracks. He didn't roll back the diplomatic relations or even some of the bilateral work that we do with Cuba. He didn't terminate things like travel, but he essentially made them more difficult so that we're going to see this relationship essentially frozen in place, I think, for some time.
And what's behind that? I mean, is this a desire to have a genuine policy shift, or is this more about unpicking the Obama administration's legacy, particularly in foreign policy?
I think it's even different from that. I think this is basically about a very narrow slice of domestic politics in the United States. Donald Trump himself supported the Cuba opening when it happened. His inclination is not to make human rights the centerpiece of relationships. He announced the latest cracking down on Cuba while he was lavishing praise on Xi Jinping for his electoral victory at the Politburo. What I think this is that there was a narrow constituency in South Florida that supported Trump in the presidential campaign. He basically rewarded that constituency by outsourcing most of his Cuba policy to Marco Rubio, and this is the result.
So for you, this is policy being made by a foreign affairs senator out of Miami rather than by the State Department itself?
Absolutely. I think from everything I've heard, the State Department, the Treasury, and Commerce Departments were essentially sidelined in this effort. Really, this policy was rewritten by Senator Rubio, and Donald Trump allowed that to happen.
How disappointed are you personally, having been one of the architects of the policy of engagement, to see it unravel so quickly?
Well, I'm disappointed, Will, mainly because of the Cuban people. They got their expectations up. They thought after December 17th, things are going to get better now. We're in a new era. And there were signs of progress that were having a direct positive benefit on their lives. The Cubans who own restaurants and small businesses and were benefiting from more travel, more remittances from the United States, this sense of Cuba coming in from the cold, being more connected to the rest of the world. I met many Cubans and saw them get their hopes up, and now I feel like they must believe that once again they're being put back into the darkness by this US-Cuba conflict that makes no sense in the context of the 21st century.
But I mean, surely the argument goes from the Trump side that, well, the United States wasn't getting anything from this and that they needed to readdress it, that it wasn't, as he put it, a good deal, and he wanted to make a better deal, which essentially was kind of drawing back. Can you see any argument for drawing down the relationship, for rolling back on what was done?
No, I really can't. I mean, first of all, we got an extraordinary amount out of this. First of all, the symbolic anchor of our Cuba policy, we cut loose. So our standing in Latin America, our standing in the world improved because of the shift in the Cuba policy. The Colombia peace deal, I don't think you get that without a U.S. envoy participating in those talks in Havana. In terms of Americans and what Americans want to do, they want to travel and do business in Cuba. So that's something we were getting out of this, the ability to travel down there. And in terms of reform in Cuba, we've tested the other model for 50 years, and putting them in a box makes it more likely that they're going to be an authoritarian regime, that they're not going to allow different voices to emerge. We were trying to create space for Cubans to get on the internet, to interact with foreign visitors, and to have greater control over their economic livelihoods. That wasn't going to transform Cuba in 2 years. It was going to allow for an incremental process of reform. So I think what Trump has done will set back the very causes he claims to want to help. And the clearest example of this, Will, is they hugged the entrepreneurs, the Cuban small business owners, who now make up about a quarter of the Cuban workforce. Well, those people are going to be devastated by any limitations on travel and business because they benefit from American travelers and American businesses coming down to Cuba.
These so-called sonic health attacks on US diplomats based in Havana, for you, are they real?
Clearly, they're real. What they are, I think, is in some question. Is this some kind of toxin? Is it some kind of sound wave? Clearly, people have been affected by these attacks. I personally don't believe that the Cuban government is behind these attacks, and frankly, our own government has gone out of its way to say that they don't have evidence that they are. Even at the height of the US-Cuba conflict throughout the Cold War, you never saw this type of attack by the Cuban government against foreign diplomats. The fact that the Canadians were affected, who have very good relationships with the Cuban government, further suggests to me that this is some third party.
And who might that third party be?
Well, the only theories that I can think of, and this is, again, not based on direct knowledge, direct information, is a party that wants to drive a wedge between the US and Cuba. Clearly, that's the intent behind these attacks. And then when I think about who that could be, I think about the Russian government, which wants to be the principal source of influence in Cuba, wants to have, essentially a line into the Caribbean, and potentially certain actors in Cuba who are more hardline, who were skeptical of the engagement with the United States, who may either be doing this on their own or with a third party like Russia. And I think, Will, it's very important that this is taking place in the context of a leadership transition in Cuba. So Raul Castro is going to step down early next year. There's a lot of fluidity there. We often in the West make a mistake of seeing Cuba as a monolith. It's not a monolith. There are different actors who are positioning themselves for this transition. And so I think, the likelihood that either Russia working with some elements or some rogue elements doing this themselves, that's clearly the scenario that I think is what's happening here, not the Cuban government doing this.
And if the intention was to drive that wedge, as you put it, it's successful, it's working.
Well, we're playing right in their hands. The fact of the matter is, the forces, whether they be foreign forces like Russia or more retrograde forces in Cuba, that want to drive a wedge between the United States and Cuba, want exactly this type of overreaction. If we're drawing down our embassy presence, we're less able to advocate for things like human rights. If we're drawing back our travel and commerce, we're opening up the door for Russia and China to be the principal sources of investment in travel to Cuba. Essentially, the Trump administration is playing right into the hands of hardline elements who don't want to see Cuba evolve in a different direction and are perfectly comfortable with the United States being the enemy and countries like Russia and China being the main sources of foreign investment.
What do you make of the new travel advice? Essentially, the US government telling US citizens that they shouldn't go to Cuba any longer, that they can't guarantee their safety.
I think that is incredibly short-sighted and frankly not based in anything. There are not any reports that this has happened to travelers. And I've said this to people who've asked me. The only reports are that this has happened to a very finite number of embassy personnel. This hasn't happened to travelers. So I saw that as a backdoor way to essentially roll back this relationship because it's not necessary to draw down the embassy to the extent that they have. It's not necessary to have a travel warning like that in place when this has not happened to travelers. So I feel like this is hardline elements in the United States, frankly, taking advantage of a very difficult situation. What we should be doing is going down there with our law enforcement and diplomatic teams and trying to figure out with the Cubans what is happening and how we can prevent this from happening.
Are you in touch with any of the diplomats from the Obama administration period who were based in Cuba? And if so, what are they saying about what's happened to the relationship?
Well, yeah, I have a lot of friends who worked or work at that embassy, and they're disappointed. They want to be out there. Our diplomats, part of what I admire about our diplomats is that they want to be on the ground, even in difficult places like Cuba. And they want to be finding new ways to engage the Cuban people, and they want to be developing new contacts in the Cuban government. And I think what they would tell you, too, is that this is exactly the time we want to be there. This is a very fluid period in Cuba with the leadership transition. There are going to be new leaders emerging. And if we're not there, we're not going to understand what's happening. It's hard enough to understand what's happening in Cuba when you are present diplomatically. But to not be there when there's going to be a new leadership cohort coming in makes no sense from a perspective of U.S. interests.
It's missing an opportunity, you'd say.
It's missing an enormous opportunity. This is, you had Fidel Castro die a year ago, or you have Raul Castro stepping aside, You have a whole host of leading jobs turning over. This is a time that we should be engaging to help understand that, hopefully help shape it around the margins, help us understand who's coming up, and help empower different Cuban voices in that process. And we're essentially taking ourselves off the field, which is exactly what, frankly, I think harder line elements in Cuba would want.
Has President Obama voiced any thoughts on what's happened to the relationship to you?
Yeah, and he's disappointed. I think what he would, he takes a pretty long view of history, and I think in his view, what we really did is we broke a certain psychological barrier between Americans and Cubans. So he still sees the value in what happened on December 17, 2014, and that we crossed a certain threshold that we can never really go back to. And you see that in the reconciliation among families, Cuban Americans and Cubans. You see that in just the activity that's taken place in the last couple of years, the foundation for a bilateral relationship that has emerged. But again, I think his belief is that you need more engagement, not less, to really reap the benefits. And frankly, taking the long view, the pendulum will swing back. I mean, one of the reasons why I don't get too disappointed is that, this is borrowed time. I describe it as kind of the last gasp of a certain hardline Cuba policy in the United States. And if there's a change in Congress and a change in the president in 2020, the pendulum can swing back very fast because of the foundation that we laid.
To the point of removing the embargo?
I think so. I mean, I think the embargo makes no sense. I think that the American people want the embargo lifted. I think the younger you are as a Cuban American, the more likely you are to want to see the embargo lifted. So this is a policy past its expiration date. Unfortunately, we don't have the right stars aligned, but if you're making a bet for history and where this is going to be 5 years from now and 10 years from now, it's not going to be stuck in this place where we have this kind of irrational Cuba policy. It's not going to be where we are able to dictate the next Cuban government, which is, I think, what some of the hardliners might want in the United States. It's going to be in a place where we're more engaged and have a more involved and mature relationship.
And I guess lastly in that sense, how can it get back to a place then, at least in the short term, which resembles more Thaw than Cold War?
I think that what I've always said about that is that and this is funny for the Democrat to be saying, government needs to just get out of the way. I mean, the thaw should be, I always thought that the success of our policy would be if Americans are traveling down there, Americans are doing business down there, American cultural and athletic institutions are down there, and they're defining the US-Cuba relationship instead of this sanctions regime that seeks to define who can do what in Cuba. I mean, the absurdity of the Trump announcement recently, we're literally telling Americans what reasons you can travel to Cuba for, where you can stay, what sodas you can buy while you're there. That's crazy. And I think it will be thaw if the US government is just out of the way here. And Cuba is right there. It's 90 miles from Florida. This is not China or Vietnam on the other side of the world. We should have the confidence that the more Americans are going down there and doing business there, the better it will be for our interests and our values, and frankly, above all, for the Cuban people.
Ben Rhodes, thanks.
Thanks, Will.